welcome to the 8th episode of The Weekly Pleb. I'm your host, Douglas Rieger. This week I spoke with art historian and museum curator Amanda Dotseth. She specializes in medieval Spain, but talks to me about some more recent turmoil in the nation's history that I think is relevant to today's society. Human history is so important to know because if we aren't aware of the mistakes we've made before, they are bound to happen again. Even though Amanda has written several art history books, I wanted to ask her about one in particular today that analyzes this massive 500-year-old altarpiece from the Ciudad of Rodrigo in Spain. I wanted to ask her about this in particular because it is on display at the University of Arizona Museum of Art right here in Tucson. So if you're in Tucson, I definitely suggest going to check it out. I want to give out a huge thank you to everybody that supports this podcast by subscribing, liking my videos, or even just telling your friends. I wouldn't be able to keep this up without you, and it's reassuring to know that there are other people who do want to learn things beyond what the mainstream media pushes on your timelines. Okay, I'm going to shut up now, so let's get into the interview. My guest expert today is museum curator from the Meadows Museum at Southern Methodist University in Texas, Amanda Dotseth. How are you, Amanda?
Fine. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So how did you first get into history and art?
Well, gosh, I guess I always liked history in school. I always preferred it to math. But the defining factor, I guess, was I'm an only child, and I had so my parents had exchange students that lived with us when I was young. And one of them was from Spain. Her name is Norma, and we're still very close. She lived with my family when I was about 12, and I visited her and her family in Spain the following year. And so that was the first exposure I had to pre-modern art, I would say, so medieval art in particular. But I really came at it because I fell in love with Spain. So I fell in love with Spain and the food and the people before I fell in love with maybe history as a topic or art as a topic. And so it wasn't until I started university at the University of Arizona that I, maybe my sophomore year, I think it was, wanted to take an art history class, and to do so I had to declare a major. So I declared a major, and then I just never left.
Awesome. Well, I like that you fell in love with the country and it stemmed from there.
Yeah.
So you said you focus on medieval Spain, right?
That's my specialty, yes.
So I'm curious, what impact did the medieval Spanish Castile era have on Catholicism and religion?
Well, I think on modern Catholicism, I guess the impact would be that the Catholic Church is one very steeped in history. It's one that's very aware of its past. It's one that is very scholarly and kind of studies the previous writings of not only, say, biblical text or scripture, but of what are called the church fathers. So there's a lot of ways, of course, that the modern Catholic Church diverges from medieval practice or even early modern practice. But there's a lot of ways also where those, traditions survive. So things that happened in the Middle Ages, so certain reforms like Gregorian reform, let's say, which is a particular moment in the history of the church where things like clerical celibacy were enforced for the first time, that have carried through to the modern day. And so there's a lot of things that, if you're trying to understand some of the debates in the current Catholic Church, you can look to the Middle Ages to see where they come from. In fact, the previous Pope, Benedict the 16th, who of course quite famously abdicated, one of his strengths, oddly enough, was he was a very good medieval scholar, and he published extensively on writings of the medieval church. And so if that gives you any idea of, you have a current Pope who was trained and educated in medieval history, I think that's a kind of really concrete example. There's also just a lot of things about the church that were shaped in this early period. And in many cases, the church always is reinventing itself and reevaluating its rules and changing. But there's a lot of things that haven't changed since the Middle Ages. So a lot of times I think by looking to the past, you can understand the present.
Definitely. I couldn't agree more with that. But one of my favorite quotes is, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme.
Yeah,
I think that's Twain.
Perfect. Exactly.
Yeah. It may not be the same characters or the same exact situation, but it sure feels familiar.
Well, we like to say that everything that happens to us now is unique, and it is quite literally unique in that we're dealing with a different set of circumstances, a different period of time, a different environment, different personalities. But that doesn't mean it's unprecedented, if that makes sense. So,
yeah. The ideas are still written in books and floating around in people's heads.
Totally. Yeah. Even if they don't know it.
Yeah. So for people that don't know much about Spanish history, maybe I want to ask you from the start. You mentioned that there's new or recent research about Columbus and his motivations or reasons for coming to find the New World. What's that all about?
Yeah, there's been a great kind of push in studies about not just Columbus, but even the conquest of the Americas in general. And this is partly, I think, driven by, just like everything else, certain things in scholarship are fashionable at different moments. And right now there is a great kind of renaissance, let's say, of studies that deal with the history of Latin America or the history of the Americas, and relationships between indigenous populations and the kind of imperial forces that shaped them. And one of the things, of course, you caught me off guard enough that I don't have the name of the scholars in my mind, but was a recent publication that dealt a little bit with what shaped Christopher Columbus's personal ideology that would have motivated him to go to the Americas. So not just what was a motivation from a kind of political standpoint, this kind of the common narrative about God, gold, glory, right? This is, of course, a factor always. But the kind of new interpretation that I've been reading about lately with great interest is focusing more on the God, one of those three G's, in that not only was Columbus, but the people who sent him, so Isabella and Ferdinand, were very much motivated by the question or by wanting to make sure that the entire planet could be converted to Catholicism. So, of course, Christopher Columbus didn't know he was going to find the Americas. He didn't know he was going to find these indigenous populations that were completely unknown to the medieval and early modern world. He thought he was, of course, gonna get a little bit further and end up in India. Yeah. But those were still people who would need to be converted from what they thought Islam to Christianity, and not just Christianity, because of course we're also dealing with, to some extent, the Protestant Reformation at this moment, but to the right kind of Christianity, so to Catholicism specifically. So there's, in this case, a kind of particular ideological motivation that is outside of the gold question, the kind of the avarice of looking for money, which was a bonus, of course, to find some, great silver mines and gold mines in the Americas, but also a very clear desire to create a world that is homogenous in terms of religion. So, and this is important, of course, because especially as the year 1500 approached, 1500 was this year that was seen as a momentous moment, a possible trigger for the apocalypse and all these things. And one of the things that signaled the coming of the end of times and the last judgment from, of course, the book of Revelation, so the final book of the Christian Bible, was that the entire population of the world would accept Christ and would be Catholic. And so he's pushing that agenda along. So he's saying, okay, if I can take part and I can get the entire world to be Catholic, then we're moving this larger Christian agenda forward. And the other part of the argument that has been interesting, I think, as well, is it argues that Christopher Columbus's worldview wasn't just shaped by this desire to make everyone Catholic, but also to make sure people weren't Muslim. Because this is, of course, anyone who knows anything about the kind of history of the Mediterranean in this period, and around 1500, is that Spain is constantly at war with the Ottoman Empire. This is when all these great stories of the Knights of Malta are coming out, and the Knights of St. John in Malta, and even Charles V, who's Isabella and Ferdinand's grandson, is fighting wars in North Africa. And it's all in this context of a kind of larger war between Christianity and Islam. So think Crusades, which are further back in time, fast forward to now the Ottoman Empire, and still this kind of struggle between Christianity and Islam, which I hope for some of your listeners resonates today. And so this is all in Christopher Columbus's mind, in Isabella and Ferdinand's mind, as they're sending them to the New World. And also, this is also the same year, 1492, quite famously, Jews are expelled from Spain, right? But it's also the year that Isabella and Ferdinand, and Christopher Columbus is there to help as a kind of military person, to conquer the kingdom of Granada in the south of Spain. So remember, Islam has been a major presence in Spain and in Iberia for 800 years. And Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492, early in the year, in like January, they conquer Granada. So all of these things come together as this sort of divine symbol that Catholicism will prevail. And this is all in Christopher's mind when he's pleading with Isabella to give him money and ships to go to the New World. And when he gets there and meets these indigenous people who he assumes are Muslim somehow, and says, okay, time to get to converting.
And nowadays the church is begging kids my age on social media to please come to mass or
are
come
they?
to anything.
Yeah. Yeah, but
yeah.
At least you're not a Muslim, Douglas. So
yeah, so that's been a trend historically. Then the church solidifying their influence, continuously trying to spread across the world, maybe not so feverishly as the Mormons, but still pretty big deal to them, right?
Mission. This, what I'm saying, is not necessarily different today. The mentality, the idea is still, once everybody has had the opportunity to become a Christian, this would in theory trigger the end of times, right? So, I mean, I'm not going to speak to contemporary theological issues. It's well outside of my area of expertise, but this is behind the missionary efforts that would certainly take place in Columbus's wake, and in the salvation, the idea that you're going to save these indigenous populations through their conversion, essentially.
I want you to tell me a little bit about the church's influence behind Franco Ferdinand in the early 1900s.
Between Francisco Franco?
Yeah.
Sure.
Francisco Franco, not Ferdinand. Sorry, I got the two mixed up. Few hundred
There's
years
Francos,
difference.
there's Ferdinands, there's Franciscos.
Yeah. But so who was he? I think a lot of people don't understand who he was, what was going on in Spain at the time, because it was overshadowed by World War II, Hitler,
Exactly.
Mussolini, things like that. So tell me a bit about him and what he did.
Sure. So the quick and dirty background is the 19th century in Spain was very tumultuous. Again, as someone who really focuses more on the 12th century, when I started studying the 19th, I found it profoundly depressing because the century sort of starts off with the Napoleonic Wars, so with Napoleon's invasion of Spain, and then the century ends with the Spanish American War, which is, of course, when Spain loses its colonies in the Philippines and in the Americas, and America gains them, right? This is the background for America's own empire and relationship with the Philippines, with Cuba, with Puerto Rico. So that's sort of bracketing the 19th century in Spain. It's like starts off with bad news and ends with bad news. And in between, there's even more bad news, which is you have a very kind of depressed rural population, high illiteracy rates, that sort of thing. And this constant struggle in the Spanish government, this tension between one faction, a Republican faction that wants to be progressive, that is responding to the ideas of the Enlightenment. So think the French Enlightenment and like Les Miserables and all of this. And you have this faction that's really trying to promote a more progressive agenda in Spain. And to some extent, that means moving away from the Catholic Church and what was to these progressives a culture for kind of superstition and ignorance. And so you have this on one side, and then on the other side, and I hope this sounds familiar to everyone listening. On one side, you have this progressive. On the other side, you have a very traditional, conservative view that that is sort of pushing for things to stay the same and for the church to continue to have the influence it had in the country, to continue to control education, for example. And so there's this tension throughout the century, and it plays out in government in that at different periods of time, the monarchy, the Republican government are in control. And there are various sort of wars and wars with maybe, a lowercase w, that deal with the line of succession, the Carlist Wars, but also it's just a very tumultuous time for Spain. And, depending on what year or what month you look at, you could find a different government in power. Then, so as we get to the end of the century, you have the Spanish-American War, and then in the early decades of the 20th century is, again, this tension is still happening. You have a kind of progressive Republican side who's pulling away from the Catholic Church, and then you have a more conservative traditional side. And from the General Franco was on this more conservative side, perhaps not surprisingly, coming from the standpoint of the military. So he was a general in the Spanish military. And in this tension, you have the Republicans kind of aligning themselves more with communism. You have Franco aligning himself more with these growing fascist nationalist movements in Europe. So these are the movements that led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini and all of this. So these are all currents that are kind of bubbling up in the 30s in Europe. And it just so happens in Spain that Francisco Franco posed a military coup in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s. And this blossomed into a full-out civil war in which case you have Republicans who are loosely backed by communist governments. And anyone who's read their Hemingway, if you've read For Whom the Bell Tolls, this is the moment we're talking about, is this conflict between the First World War and the Second World War, where Spain has these two kind of political factions, and to some extent they're fighting for the future ideology of Spain? Are they going to be a, secular society, one that is progressive, or are they going to kind of retrench in what has been their past and the kind of close affiliation with the Catholic Church? Long story short, of course, Franco wins, and the kind of famous episodes of the Spanish Civil War that maybe you've heard of. So the bombing of Wernicke, for example, which was, of course, famously depicted by Pablo Picasso in that huge mural, which is now in Spain. And of course, this is evidence of Franco's alignment with Hitler. And basically, Hitler using this small town in Spain's Basque Country as a testing ground for the kind of weapons that he would then later use in the Second World War. And Franco making the proverbial deal with the devil to do that because it supported his agenda and certainly helped him come out victorious in that war. Franco didn't die till 1975. So it's a very different mentality than what you see with, say, Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, where, there was enough foreign intervention, essentially, by the United States and others, and Britain, of course. And the Allies came out victorious and whatever. But in Spain, that wasn't the case. And the war ended in 1939. So it sort of ended before the Second World War really kicked off. And, we always joke one of the only good things Franco did is he kept Spain out of the Second World War. But by then the deal had been done, as it were. And so Spain basically had a fascist dictator between 1939 and 1975. I mean, let that sink in.
A progressive fight versus a conservative fight during a polarized era.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why that sounds so familiar to me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, what was the Valle de Cairos?
Oh gosh.
And why is it controversial?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that adds perfectly to the story of Franco, and one that we meaning art historians talking it have really dealt with a lot. And I think it ties in perfectly with some of the debates happening in America right now about, say, Civil War monuments, American Civil War monuments. So Valle de los Caídos, which literally means Valley of the Fallen, was a kind of one of Franco's post-war vanity projects, let's say, but he meant it to be a kind of reconciliation. This was his intention, was, brother against brother, we had this horrible war, so many people died, let me build this thing that represents a sort of unification of the Spanish people. Now that you've heard me talk about the Spanish Civil War and the two factions, it may, you can see why people might, at least the Republican side, would be outraged by the form it took, which was a monastery, literally a Catholic monastery, with a big cross. I mean, you can see the thing from the highway when you drive north out of Madrid. And if you haven't seen a photo of it, Google it, because it is not subtle. It is very intentionally located quite close to what was Philip II. So we're going back in time here, to the 14th century. Philip what did I just say? 16th century. Philip II's palace, which was a palace monastery, because that sounds like fun, right? Yay, palace with some monks. So he's very, very deliberately situating this new monastery next to a much older monastery with a king who is known for being pious, right? So, and it's also a place of burial. So his idea that this was going to be a reconciliatory gesture was by burying both the Republican and fascist dead in this place. right? So
with a cross over all of them.
with a big old cross and a bunch of monks.
It's basically like saying, "Oh, we're all happy together again, but we'll pray for you." Wink, wink.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then on top of it, he builds it by using Republican prisoners of war. So, I mean, it's like insult to injury. So you're just like, wait a minute, let me get this straight. You're saying this is supposed to unify the country and bring everyone together, but you're using essentially slave labor from the people who lost. Then you're burying the Republican dead at this place. And, you know, I always think these poor people must still be rolling in their graves to, you know, to have been everything they believed and fought for, and then being buried in this uber Catholic, uber fascist monument, right? And so, and keep in mind, we're talking about the early 40s when this is built, right? So people related to, you know, the Republican dead who are buried there are still alive. You know, they still there know Uncle what's his name is, you know, or whoever is buried at this hideous site, which, by the way, I've never visited in person because I've never been able to psych myself up. Like, and then on top of all of that, Franco has himself buried there. So, like, you just imagine, because of course he has himself buried there, so the monks can pray for his soul for, you know, ever. So what's controversial about this site, I probably don't even have to tell you now why this site is controversial. There are relatives of the Republican dead who are still alive, who know that their relatives are buried there. There are the prisoners, the Republican prisoners of war who helped build it. Many of them died while building it, and so they're there. Franco himself, until very recently, I don't know if you saw in the news, was also buried there. They not that long ago exhumed his body and moved it to his family's plot. But it's deeply controversial, and this came up very recently. I was at a seminar a few years ago in Madrid. The fabric of the building is actually having some issues. So there are structural issues. And the question is, what do you do about it? Do you repair it? Do you tear the whole damn thing down? Because, you know, and there's a kind of stalemate there about what to do with this site, from the state level and from the level of this is patrimony, right? This is still national patrimony, and it's important to the history of Spain, as vile as it is. And then add a whole new layer, which is still an active monastery. So the Catholic Church has a stake.
And you also have to think of the other side of of course, there's relatives that are upset that they have family there. But I'm sure there's probably some relatives that are very proud that their families are buried on the other side of it, right? Or
absolutely.
Or vice versa.
Or maybe they're not proud. But, you know, there's a lot at stake on both sides.
But don't dig them up.
Yeah, and anytime you're dealing with exhuming human remains, it's really tricky. And this has happened a lot. This has been an issue in Spain a lot as well, for the exhumation of these mass burials, particularly mass Republican burials across Spain. So this is when, you know, someone lost a battle and the army just threw all the bodies into a kind of mass grave, and this of course became very famous because one of these mass graves is thought to be where the famous poet Garcia Lorca is buried. And so now you have a kind of national treasure who is possibly in one of these mass graves, which adds a whole new kind of layer to the problem. And his descendants are still alive to weigh in. So yeah, it's kind of a big mess. And I think everybody's, you know, Spain is still kind of reconciling this history again. I mean, you think about the distance we have from the Civil War, our Civil War, which of course was in the 1860s. And we're still reconciling that past, and we're still trying to decide what we do with the monuments, both from that era and the monuments created in the 20th century that referred to that era, and we're still kind of reconciling that dialogue. This is a much more recent past for Spain. And so I think, it's understandable to some extent that they're kind of dealing with all of these issues now. Still dealing with them, and there's no clear solution, but there's kind of baby steps in the sense that Franco's out of there already, but now what?
There's something with these fascists, Pol Pot, Hitler, Franco, they like mass graves for some reason.
Mass graves and really big monuments. So
yeah.
And part of me wants to see the thing bulldozed to the ground because ew, gross, but at the same time, it's like that iconic image of the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down in the Second Gulf War, and you kind of on some level feel good seeing that because you're thinking, oh, great, things are going to be better, or things are better. But as an art historian, that's still an object, and that's still a work of art that has some sort of value, as vile as it is. And censoring or forgetting our past doesn't get us anywhere either.
Yeah, that's my biggest fear, is erasing the worst parts of history. Generations from now, they're just not going to know about those parts of history. And then similar things are going to happen again, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm curious. I have one more question. With the it seems like the Catholic Church kind of backed Franco, right? Or at least helped him out. So is there any other cases, I can't think of any, where the church kind of backed fascism or extreme conservatism? Other than the evangelical church?
Probably. I also don't want to paint this as so black and white, in the sense that in the Spanish Civil War, there were a number of Republican priests as well. But institutionally, the church was at the very least complacent in what Franco's agenda was, which on some level makes sense because he was saying Spain should remain a Catholic nation. And that is for the greater good in theory, if you are a Christian and believe that. I think the Catholic Church in particular and evangelical churches have certainly supported a number of progressive issues over time as well. I can't think of a good example in the modern period where you have where you have such a kind of close alliance, let's say, with the Catholic Church and with a military coup. I'm sure there are examples, and I just am not as familiar with them. But again, you take there's bad and good in this scenario. I think the issue in the case of the church and the Spanish Civil War is, at least in more recent periods, is that there has been a kind of disconnect in the way the Republican dead have been treated, whether Catholic or not, whether priest or not, and the those who died on the Catholic or on the Franco side. So, for example, the declaration of individuals as martyrs, right, which means you've died for your faith, has been granted to one side and not the other. So this is where there's still these kind of controversial issues that have been raised, with not just Spain reconciling its civil war and reconciling this part of the episode in its past, but also the church reconciling this part of its past. The church has made great strides, I would say, in recent decades in terms of sort of issuing apologies for things like, pogroms and genocides and the Crusades and stuff like that. And Spain too, Spain recently offered citizenship to the descendants of Jews who were expelled in 1492. So, It's like,
Yeah,
thanks.
600 years later. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
I'm not coming over there, but
Exactly.
yeah.
And it's like, okay, maybe this doesn't make practical changes, but it is a kind of evidence of a reconciliation or a reckoning with these atrocities of the past. We'll probably see more as years go on, and particularly in terms of the Americas. But I think it's kind of slower moving when it comes to more recent past. I mean, if it took 500 plus years for for the Spanish government to offer citizenship to Jews expelled in 1492, we perhaps might not be able to fully expect the same kind of reconciliation to happen for something that took place in the 1930s. So
Yeah.
so I can't, again, someone who is more specialized perhaps in church history might be able to have a good example for you. But and I certainly don't want to paint the Catholic Church as a terrible institution by any means, because but certainly the alliance in this case is not perhaps the best.
Okay. So before we finish up here, I want you to tell me a little bit about your book and what you did to get it together and kind of what it's about. So then anyone listening can look it up and find it online.
Buy it.
Yeah,
Don't get
buy
royalties.
They're not for free. They're not. But
It's called Fernando Gallego
Where
and
did
his
you get
workshop,
yours?
the Altarpiece from Ciudad, Rodrigo. Don't worry about that.
Oh, okay.
I have my methods.
Okay.
So tell me a little bit about your book.
Sure. So this is a project I worked on now quite some time ago. Really, it was the product of work done between about 2004 and 2008. That was the result of a collaboration between the Meadows Museum and the University of Arizona Art Museum, UAMA, Museum of Art, University of Arizona Museum of Art, which has in its possession this amazing, what's left of this amazing retablo or altarpiece from a town close to the border between Spain and Portugal called Ciudad, Rodrigo. And if whoever's listening to this is in Tucson or cares about the University of Arizona, I do encourage you to go see it. It's really something else. There's something like 25, 26 panels. And they're huge. They're a meter tall by half a meter wide, more or less, painted on wood panel that left Spain in the 19th century and then ended up in the US via England. And so this multi-year project was in collaboration with UAMA, the Meadows Museum, and the Kimball Art Museum, which is in Fort Worth, and which has a state-of-the-art conservation lab. And so we brought all the panels to Fort Worth. Claire Berry, who's the director of conservation there, with her team, did very extensive technical analysis. So we looked at what the pigments were made out of and underdrawing and things like that. And other members of the team, Barbara Anderson, myself, did art historical research on them as well. And then it was all published in that book. So, which I edited and contributed to. But
I enjoyed it a lot. The pictures.
Oh, you read it, eh?
I skimmed it.
Read it cover to cover?
No, I did not. I won't lie to you. But the pictures and the panels are incredible, and the
But you looked
infrared
at the
technology
pictures.
where you
Hey,
can-
that's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I did the bare minimum. No,
That's great.
But the infrared technology is pretty impressive. That you can look
It's
underneath
cool.
and see the original sketching
Yeah.
from these artists, and it seemed like that's tell who did what, right? Because every artist has their own methods and stuff, right?
Yeah. I think one of the kind of biggest discoveries probably of the project was that it kind of nuanced our view of how these large altarpieces were made. We knew workshops were involved, but as ever, nothing's as simple as it seems. And so I think what it showed us was that this kind of workshop process is extremely dynamic. And so when you try to attribute a painting or assign an author to it, you're looking at the painted surface, But once you can see below the surface and you see that underdrawing, there's kind of a different level of attribution. And so you could have a panel that is designed by one individual and painted by another. And so, you know, it might make you want to tear your hair out, but that was, I would say, one of the best discoveries. And what was nice about the exhibition itself is, you know, it's kind of hard to see in the book. It's hard to see that underdrawing. You can see it better in some of the details. But in the exhibition, we actually had full-size infrared reflectogram mosaics on light boxes. So it was a really nice way to kind of highlight the artist's draftsmanship, not just the painting. And it's a real treasure to have right there in Tucson. So go see it.